the West didn't really have to offer very interesting goods to China. China was exporting high quality goods, right? Silk Road and so on. And the West only had, in a way, the Latin American robberies of gold and silver to offer. And when that supply was ended, then in a way, yeah, the United Kingdom had to open East Asian harbors by force. And this is a prominent hypothesis of this great divergence. Um, yeah, another hypothesis is about internal conflicts in China itself that, for instance, did not make China a maritime power in the 16th century when it could have become one because it had the largest fleet of the world. It had the technology in place to start also an industrial revolution, but then it didn't. And Max Weber, before the letter, so avant la lettre even, contributed to this debate on great divergence, if you want, by offering a more institutional and a religious explanation also of why capitalism took off in the West and not in the East. So remember that Weber's explanandum is why modern rational capitalism took off and why other, let's say, economic systems were remained in other parts of the world. And Weber published then his essay here on Confucianism and Taoism in the 1910s of his life and offered a couple of explanations for this great divergence. So first of all, at the time, like before 1910, Weber wrote very, let's say, uninformed about East Asia. He repeated some of the standard explanations for differences of East Asian economies by pointing to the fact that these were civilizations without milk, had rather horticultural agriculture, no individual herd ownership, so individual property, important institution for capitalism, was not there. They tended to have centralized bureaucracies built on complex irrigation systems, but they did not have, let's say, the democratic bottom-up kind of city-states that were important for the rise of this class of bourgeois that organized capitalism in the West, and that even authors nowadays like Daron Acemoglu see as the source of innovativeness in the West. But yeah, this is a very stylized kind of opposition that Weber had. From the 1910s onward, then, Weber drew on a very particular source to inform himself about East Asia, which was the missionary writings mostly. So Western missionaries in China or also India writing about their observations, which, as you can imagine, is a little bit of a biased source, and this also characterizes Weber's work here on China. In his 1915 book then on Confucianism and Taoism, he points to important institutional differences between Europe and China to explain why capitalism took off then in Europe rather than in China. So one is, mentioned this already, that Europe developed more of this autonomous urban citizenry that was entrepreneurial and that was different from the kinship-based clan organization in Chinese cities. He points to the more decentral feudalist system, right, with a lot of military conflict and competition, which also, I mean, was very destructive, but also helped to sort of push competition in favor of more innovation, not least in the military, but also in the economy, and that this was different in a centralized bureaucracy as the one in China, which was already a unified kind of empire before our times. He points also to what is often important, or usually important to Weber, this rationally organized kind of large-scale agriculture, which dominated more in the West when compared to fragmented land ownership in the East. He points to the maritime colonial expansion, so colonialism also in the West, whereas China expanded continentally. And last but not least, he points to the dominant strata in China being the Mandarins, so education-centered literati, who were more interested, let's say, in non-economic goals when compared to the Western commercial bourgeoisie. All of these were institutional differences that Weber noticed. Here comes then what he considers as the religious or idea-based explanation of the Great Divergence. He mainly sees in Confucianism also an ethics that has a strong work discipline and brings along interesting virtues in favor of more and more work, but he categorizes it as one that is not commercially interested. Yeah, so he also sees Confucianism as being similar to Protestantism in that the goals that believers have and follow do not have transcendental elements, so they don't only strive for being saved in heaven, but they both try to change something here in the world, so non-transcendental in the world, but with the difference being that then, according to Weber, the Confucianist rather tries to affirm the world as it is, also rationally so, whereas then the Protestant aims at basically rationally changing the world to already gain some kind of salvation here on earth. So these categories, whether a religion has a transcendental or non-transcendental focus, and whether it produces a work ethics that is directed towards changing, manipulating the world already. These are important elements also when Weber describes the influence of religion, for instance, in Islamic countries or of Judaism on economic life. So what are we to make of this description of Weber's based on missionary writings? So when you read the secondary literature, then I would say the broad summary is, well, it's often very, very false in the details, but still inspiring. Yeah? So many details, Weber got it wrong. He writes also generally, you may have noticed this already, with a strong Eurocentric focus. Yeah, so you notice in his writings that there's a certain complacency and satisfaction with solving a puzzle in which the West sort of looks good, while rather ignoring, or let's say, the negative consequences of colonialism, for instance. And this Eurocentric orientation is also something that you find in this comparison between China of the time and Europe. But it's also interesting to see, just as a footnote here, how Weber, who himself is part of this educated bourgeoisie, sort of falls a little bit in love with the idea of the literati, so the education-centered mandarins that govern the Chinese bureaucracy and state. This is something that I think Weber really enjoyed, and this is, I think, noticeable in his work as well. So in today's Chinese sociology, there is a certain also rehabilitation of Weber's writing, despite it being very wrong in the details. So let me conclude with pointing to a more general sociology of religion that Weber is also the founder of, and which ever since Weber has not only looked at capitalism and the emergence of capitalism as a phenomenon, but also as more phenomena. So first of all, there are studies like Bell's studies here, very famous from the 1950s, which in a way update Weber. So in the 50s, Bell observed in the post-war consumption boom that in light of the consumption and leisure time explosion in American society, there was a certain contradiction put in the very motor of capitalist production, namely the work ethic, person's work ethic was more and more undermined in favor of more and more consumption, sorry. This book then is probably still very up to date. So given all of the consumption opportunities we have nowadays, how adequate is it still for Weber's explanation to point to the strict work ethic? Another update is by the French sociologist Boltanski and Yves Chapelleau in their book on the new spirit of capitalism. They think that Weber's account of the Protestant entrepreneur is basically historically correct for the time when there were still these captains of industry, these heroic directors also in management capitalism, managing the big bureaucratic corporations. It's less adequate to describe the kind of capitalism that started to emerge from the 1970s onwards, which is much, let's say, more based on flexible networks, and where something like the self-organized manager in teams is more important, and they use the consultancy firm and management consultant self-help kind of literature and manuals in order to distill what they call the new spirit